Now, very often, our discernments are simply too complex for divination, or at least the kind of magic 8-ball answers that we get with divination. It's simply not nuanced enough to do the job of responsible spiritual discernment. So in this class, we're going to be looking at a lot of techniques for discernment that are capable of doing the sort of heavy lifting that we actually need. We're going to be using logic. We're going to be using emotions. We're going to be using the imagination. St. Ignatius especially seemed to speak of the imagination as an organ of perception, so we'll be making good use of it in this class. We're also going to be asking other people to help us. One of the best ways to get help from other people is through spiritual direction. I'm sure many of you have had experience with spiritual direction in the past. Spiritual direction is a complex ministry requiring special training. But all of us who do ministry in any context are going to be called on to provide spiritual guidance of one kind or another. Now, in this class, I'm not going to be training you to do spiritual direction. I do train spiritual directors, but we're not going to be doing that here. Instead, we're going to be doing what James Martin in his book calls faith sharing. We're going to be holding space as people make discernments about their spiritual lives. Call it spiritual direction light, if you like. Now, in spiritual direction, there's one overarching goal, and that goal is intimacy with God. As they talk, a spiritual direction and his or her client look for the movement of God in the life of the client. Very often, we're simply too close to our own spiritual journey to see it clearly, because we see every moment as it passes, so we're often not aware of the larger scope of movement or change. It's kind of like how parents are often not as aware of how much their children have grown as grandparents are, because the parents see the kids every day, but the grandparents only see them every month or so. It's the same in spiritual direction. A director and a client, they only meet about once a month usually. And in that time, as they talk, motion towards or away from God can be detected. Also, it's the spiritual director's job to notice when people are moving away from God, or when somebody is resisting God in some way. Part of what the director does is to point out when he or she notices this kind of resistance. Now, in spiritual direction, we ask a lot of the same questions that we'll be asking in this class. Where is God in the various arenas of my life? What does God want from me? What gets in the way of my intimacy with God? In what ways am I holding God at arm's length? Okay, at this point you're probably saying, why is he going on about spiritual direction like this? I'm going on about it because it's the most efficient way of ensuring, gauging, and encouraging somebody's growth towards God. And so we're going to be doing it in this class, pretty much in every module. Now, you thought this was going to be a safe class, but it's really not. It's going to be kind of a scary class, because we're not actually going to be talking about discernment as if it was an academic discipline. We're going to be doing discernment as if we were all actually spiritual beings, because that's what we are. Let's talk for a minute about what spiritual direction is not. It's not psychotherapy. Psychotherapy is often focused on pathologies or on human relationships. But we're not focused on those things in spiritual direction. We're focused on one thing and one thing only: intimacy with God. Spiritual direction is also not a time to unload all of our complaints or vent It's also not time to waste. In fact, it is some of the most precious time you will ever have, if you avail yourself of it, of course, and do it with sincerity and an open heart. Now, usually when people do spiritual direction, they meet once a month, usually for an hour at a time, in a completely private place, and the director usually charges between $50 and $100 for that time. In our class, we're going to be doing faith sharing, spiritual direction light. We're going to be doing it for each other. We're going to be working one-on-one for about 15 minutes each, for free. What a bargain. Of course, I know few of you are trained as spiritual directors, and I want to make this safe for everyone. So instead of regular spiritual direction, which involves a lot of back and forth, we'll be following the rules that James Martin sets down in his book for faith sharing. When you are in the role of the sharer, when you're doing the talking, I invite you to be completely honest, completely forthcoming. I invite you to be vulnerable. Vulnerable to the degree that you feel safe doing so, and maybe just a little bit beyond your comfort level, if you can manage it. The things that you're going to be discussing are some of the most important and significant things in your life. And I would like to ask you to trust this process and to cooperate with it, because I promise you, if you do, it will change you forever. Now, if you are in the role of the listener, I invite you to be cautious and reserved. It is largely your job to listen and to notice. It's not your job to diagnose or to fix anything. It's fine to ask clarifying questions, but for the rest of the time, you should simply be listening. In fact, you should not be speaking at all. It's your job to hold the space with peaceful and prayerful intention. It's God's job to do the work. So if you can get yourself out of the way and just be present and trust that God is doing the work in the life of this person, you're going to be amazed at what will happen. And you're going to learn a lot from it that is immediately applicable to your own journey. It's kind of an unwritten law in spiritual direction that God always sends you clients that are dealing with exactly the same things you are dealing with. So don't be surprised when your stuff comes up in a session. It's perfectly normal. All right, ready to give it a try?